Good morning, everybody. It's a joy to be here. I was really pleased that UCET invited me to speak to you this morning. It's been fabulous being at this conference and having an opportunity to speak to teacher educators from all over the UK. That's been a real privilege. As my bio says, I started my life out as a drama teacher, so to be in Stratford-on-Avon is amazing because I've never been here and it's on my bucket list. So I got the chance to see King John at the RSC on Monday evening, so that was a privilege. And you know, last night, the Dusty Springfield tribute, that was a privilege as well. I absolutely loved Dusty Springfield. And so those three things coming together has meant I've really been looking forward to coming here. I think Freud called it synchronicity, when things connect, no such thing as coincidence. So last night when the Dusty Springfield singer transformed herself into Lulu and sang Shout, I thought synchronicity was working to the power 10. They must have known that I came from Scotland, and Lulu was actually my dad's favourite singer. So that was great. But I'm here really to talk about something that happened in Scotland, a piece of policy that was created, and how was that policy created? It's a narrative, and like any good narrative, there are great characters, there's a setting, and there's also a huge amount of problems to be resolved before you get to the end of the narrative. So today is really about, you know, what was that narrative? Who were the characters in the setting? What were the problems that they encountered? How did they solve those problems? And how did they get to the point where they produced a report that recommended alternative career pathways for teachers and ways of encouraging teachers to stay in the profession and develop within the profession? So what I'd like to do is start by setting the scene, okay? So the size and structure of Scotland, I think it's quite important maybe to think about that. So the population of Scotland is 5.25 million in 2018. In Scotland, we have 357 secondary schools. We have 2,012 primary schools and 133 additional needs schools. At the last count, we had 51,138 practising teachers. We have a shortage in Scotland. I'm sure all of you in this room could name our shortages in teaching. They're in science, maths, computing, and home economics. Scotland doesn't struggle to recruit teachers to areas of multiple deprivation, but they do struggle to recruit teachers to rural settings. In terms of retention, I thought it was really interesting listening to Mary yesterday about the retention figures in England. And so I took the time yesterday to look up our retention figures. After 6 years, 17% of teachers have left the profession. There is statistics around why they've left the profession, and those range from the same issues that Mary discussed yesterday about pressures of work, about overburdensome administration within the job, behaviour management. But also, interestingly, they cite moving to another country to teach, which is quite a common move for some of our early career teachers, and moving to another country or a change of career. So that's 17% of the teaching workforce leaving after 6 years. Also, if we go into things like teacher education, as many of you know, there is one route to becoming a teacher in Scotland. You have to go through a university to do that. And the retention rate there is round about 91% retention of people who begin teacher education, 91% finished. So that's the kind of size and structure. The next, the setting of the scene, the commitment from government and unions. That was really important, that the commitment to create a new piece of policy was a joint commitment, and one that involved the unions from the beginning. And you can see the impact that has as I go through the narrative of creating this report, the impact of the unions being involved. An international summit on the teaching profession in 2017 really reflected on internationally, how do we motivate teachers to stay in the profession? How do we keep teachers engaged and refreshed in the really important work that they do? Scottish Education, the Next Steps paper in Scottish Government, again in 2017, committed to reviewing the career pathways for teachers. The next bullet point around the Head Teachers Charter, a very interesting piece of legislation. The Scottish Government, about 2 years ago, created a Head Teachers Charter, and this is where they empowered head teachers to take much more responsibility for their school in terms of budgets, being able to create almost any type of school that they felt fitted the context in which they taught. So they could staff the school in any way they wanted. They could have a structure where staff were promoted in any way that they wanted. And it gave a huge amount of autonomy to head teachers. Now, that Head Teachers Charter was tied in to a head teacher's qualification. So in Scotland, if you want to become a head teacher, you have to have a master's certificate, which is round about 90 credits at master's level before you can be promoted to that post. And this charter was tied in to the qualification that was becoming mandatory in Scotland around head teachers. So head teachers were having a huge amount of autonomy. Now, the government wanted that to be legislated. They wanted it to be in law what head teachers had to do within their school. And there was a huge backlash to that from the profession. And so they listened to that, and it's now not in law, but it's a recommendation that that's what head teachers are going to do. And the final bullet point is the attainment challenge. Many of you know about the Scottish Attainment Challenge. That's the commitment from our government to close the gap in achievement between children in areas of multiple deprivation and children who are in more affluent areas. And that's been a huge focus of policy. It's been a huge focus of investment in Scottish education. So schools have, very much like the pupil premium, for every child in a school who's from a postcode of multiple deprivation, each school receives around about £1,600 per head. So we have some schools in Scotland with additional budgets of, well over, and I'm not going to put a figure on it because my maths isn't fantastic, but they have a good budget. So that's a scene in Scotland. Scotland's a small country. Every single stakeholder in education can be round the table in a day. They can leave their own home in the morning and go back to their own home at night and sit down at a table and have a conversation for about 4 or 5 hours. And I think that's quite important in small systems, that they have that ability to meet together. So a career panel pathway was set up, and the remit of that career panel was agreed between governments and unions. So in June 2018 was the first meeting of that panel, and the panel was commissioned by the Scottish Joint Negotiating Committee, and that committee is jointly chaired by the government, local authorities and the union. And that's really important that it came through that process. So it had the commitment of the major stakeholders within Scottish education. So as you can see from the bullet points, the first one was to engage with the profession in Scotland and develop a model of career pathways to develop something different. And I love that word, exciting, careers in teaching. I thought that was really interesting that they chose that. To consider international evidence, what happens, what's happened previously in Scotland in terms of career progression, and this debate around curricular specialisms, pedagogies and leadership. Engaging with the wider education sector as well, and exploring, the link between a career pathway and qualification. For example, many of us, in education, grappling with, if you have a qualification, higher than an undergraduate degree, should you earn more money? And the final one was to make a recommendation around remuneration. I could never say remuneration until I got involved with this panel. And that was an interesting one. And I'll talk to you about what we found from teachers in terms of remuneration. So the cast. Who were there? Who were the people round the table? First, the independent chair. That was my role. So I was appointed to be the independent chair of this panel. So I literally, within that role, had to almost take away my thoughts, feelings, experience, and facilitate what happened in that panel. I was not there representing teacher education. I was there as an independent person who was going to take the panel along to the point where we were creating a report. I suppose as Shakespeare wrote, as you like it, that all the world's a stage and all the men and women are merely players, and they have their entrances and their exits. And what was interesting was this list of players or actors or stakeholders, we can call them lots of different names, brought with them the people they were representing. So they were bringing with them what they needed for the stakehold that they had within education. And when you have that round the table, you also have the subtext. It's quite like a play, actually. And so all the sort of nuances that are happening and the backdrop of Scottish education. And I think just interestingly, during the panel, when they met from June 2018 till April of this year, there was pay negotiations going on, and there was teacher strikes going on as well. Now, towards the end of the panel, it was all resolved and teachers in Scotland got a pay rise, but that had a huge influence on the negotiations that we had. So I'll just go through who were the actors and what was their role. So the independent chair, that was myself. There with no hat on, no agenda, other than to guide the panel through what they were going to do. The Secretariat, Scottish Government, they were the senior civil servants who worked with our Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, who was responsible for education and very much had an eye on the kind of political agenda around education in Scotland. Next one down, we had the Association of Directors of Education. So that was a representative who who represented all the directors of education in Scotland. Now, the directors of education, or the local authorities, they are technically the employers of teachers. So they're the one that hold the salary budgets, etc. Next one along, the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, that's COSLA. So they represented the local authorities, not just in education, but the local authorities in everything that they looked after. We had the Society of Local Authority Chief Executives, so again very much connected to COSLA, people who were responsible for the whole budget in a local authority, not just the education budget, so responsible for the health budget, the budget for the roads, etc. So they had a broader view of what was happening. The Society for Personnel and Development, so that's really HR, and so what can you do in terms of teachers' terms and conditions? Education Scotland, that's the body in Scotland that looks after the curriculum. It's the body in Scotland that houses HMI, who are the inspectors of education, and it's the body in Scotland that looks after the College for Educational Leadership. Next, we have the General Teaching Council of Scotland. So they are the ones who are an independent body who have the standard for teachers. So in Scotland, we have a standard for provisional registration, we have a standard for registration, and we have a standard for lifelong registration, and we have a standard for leadership. So there's 4 standards in Scotland. So they're the people who look after and say, you know, here is what we expect, here is the bar for teachers in Scotland. We had teacher organisations, so that's the unions. So we have 6 unions in Scotland. And really importantly, every single union was represented on that panel. So every union in Scotland had a voice. And finally, the universities, so the Scottish Council of Deans, so that was the representative who represented the universities and their role. Now, in total, that was 16 people round the table. And at the end, I'll reflect on the process of negotiating a written report with 16 people. And if you think of all the actors in this, and if you think about all the subtext and what they need or what they are looking for, it at times almost seemed an impossible task. So these are the actors. You know the remit of the panel. What did we do in terms of the process? How did we make the remit come alive? We began by commissioning a literature review. So the literature review was authored by Dr. Stephen Courtney from the University of Manchester. As a panel, we agreed that it would be a series of case studies. What was interesting, our first negotiation was what 5 countries would we pick to do a case study, and why would we pick these countries? If you're absolutely super at geography from that visual, you'd be able to tell me what the 5 countries are. If you're not super at geography, I'm going to read them out. Australia, Ontario, Estonia, Finland, and Singapore. So 5 countries picked for a number of different reasons. Some because they were relatively the same size as Scotland. Some because they had systems which were relatively close to the systems within Scotland. Interestingly, the review of literature sort of threw up lots of different questions. So I'll maybe just briefly go through what they were thinking about. Australia. So what happens in Australia? They've got 4 discrete categories of teachers. They've got graduate, proficient, highly accomplished, and lead. And it's based on a teacher standard that is aligned to competencies, and it is not connected to salary progression. In Ontario, career progression is through gaining additional qualifications. So there's a basic qualification, and then there's a higher qualification that has 6 different stages. So it goes A, A1, A2, A3, A4, A5. And it's dependent on experience and qualification as to what level you are pitched at. And this is in quotes. There is a minimal pay scale advancement each scale you go up. So that's in Ontario. So Estonia, they're going through a huge amount of reform, and they're moving to a new career system which is very much based on the Singapore model. So the Singapore model is around having a senior teacher and a master teacher. And those 2 levels of senior teacher and master teacher are voluntary and not salaried. Finland, they've got a teacher development programme which was launched in 2016, and it's aimed at creating a really systematic structure for teacher competencies. It's overseen by a new body of Teacher Education Forum, and sabbaticals are statutory entitlement for all employees in Finland. Teachers may progress to their career to become a vice principal or a principal. So really in Finland, there's teacher, and then there's vice principal and principal. Singapore, highly structured. Many of you are familiar with the Singapore system. So we have a senior teacher, lead teacher, master teacher, and then principal master teacher. It's based on attainment. It's very criteria driven. It includes an interview and a performance appraisal if you're going to move. And there's 2 separate tracks in Singapore in terms of a leadership track and a learning and teaching track. And the standard or the level that you achieve is very much connected to salary. The literature review was really interesting. Some of the key points emerging from it is that the review shows that there is a variety of teacher autonomy in each of the 5 countries, and that there is no real correlation between recruitment, retention, and structure. It's certainly true that diverse education systems are experiencing problem with teacher recruitment and retention, and those problems from the literature review have a real effect on teacher workload and teacher morale. I think kind of a health warning almost on the literature review that, there's different contexts and different policies, and attempting to find a solution in Scotland by just borrowing from another system will not necessarily support the creation of a new pathway. And the author really did suggest that there is a lack of evidence in terms of the relationship between a career pathway and outcomes for young people. And that for me is really interesting, because often when chairing the panel, many people kept saying, you know, where's the voice of the child? You know, where is our commitment to improving educational outcomes for children? And I said, that will come at the beginning. I think it has to be clear that everything we are doing is about improving the educational outcomes for children. But this is about improving the career structure and the career prospects for teachers. And that does have a knock-on effect as to what happens with children. Okay, the next slide lets you see really quite a lot of information there, but it lets you see the next stage of our process. Oh, it hasn't gone to the next slide. There we go, the next slide. We had a teacher survey. So as you can see from the slide there was 67,500 roughly teacher surveys sent out. You may have remembered at the start of my talk, I said there was 51,300 odd teachers in Scotland. Well, that's a bigger number, and that's because we have a bigger number of teachers registered as teachers as actually teach. So that was a survey. As you can see, we got 3,700 responses back, and then it breaks down to show you how many of those responses were from primary teachers and how many were from secondary teachers. We also had a stakeholder survey, and to that we had 350 responses. So it was a huge amount of data was coming back to the panel. We held 6 national events, and you can see from the small map of Scotland there where those events were. We had returns from the Scottish Learning Festival. We had articles in the General Teaching Council magazine. And then at the bottom, what you can see is these are all the stakeholders that were represented in the panel. You can see the unions, symbols, you can see the symbols of the different universities, etc. And all of those people had their own events. And what we did as a panel, we created a PowerPoint, we created a series of questions for people to ask within those events. So that was the panel's engagement with stakeholders. And what that produced was a huge amount of data. And a huge amount of data for the panel to sift through and use as an evidence base for the policies that they began to develop. So these are the themes that began to emerge from the data. A lot of the stakeholders and the teachers talked about how attractive is a leadership role. Why would you want to take that? A lot of our early career teachers found any leadership role to be far too big a leap in the classroom. They were very keen that they had smaller leadership roles, that they were given a leadership role to look after something specific in a school, possibly even a leadership role that was time-bound, that it was a piece of work where they could actually do that piece of work and finish that piece of work. That was really a very clear message from our early career teachers. How attractive is a promoted post? That's the balance, the amount of work that you're asked to do when you're in a promoted post. Is it something? So there was a lot spoken about promoted posts which didn't harmonise with home life, promoted posts which just induced stress, promoted posts where the level of responsibility was not commensurate with the remuneration, I still can't say that word, remuneration connected to it. The curricular and pedagogical specialisms, they felt in Scotland that had started to dilute, that the creation of faculty heads where there was a principal teacher looking after large groups and subjects was starting to strip back this notion of being a curricular specialist. Again, really interesting, the length of service and experience gained. Does that make you a good teacher? And a question that's grappled with, people saying, I have worked for 25 years and I am doing this, why am I not being remunerated for that when I have that level of experience? Opportunities to lead aspects of school improvement. I think that was really clear that people were looking for opportunities to lead, but not opportunities to lead as a principal teacher or, as many people talked about, kind of an administrator role almost within schools. Opportunities for sabbaticals. Overwhelmingly, teachers in Scotland were really interested in the notion of a sabbatical. Some of the international examples were really inspiring to teachers, and they talked very passionately about the opportunity to have a sabbatical, and that was a real challenge for the panel in terms of how do you make that happen. Placements outside of education, that's something that people were really interested in doing and working, beyond the school. Higher qualifications, again, a great debate. Does any kind of teacher learning or teacher development beyond initial teacher development have to be certificated, have to be credit-worthy in terms of a master's programme and connected to that, and another debate. And the last one was about remuneration and also time. And it was very interesting in ploughing through the data that it wasn't about how much money people got. It was about how much time. And I thought that was really quite stark in terms of the engagement. What I'm going to show you now is just a couple of word dolls, just 2 word dolls that maybe give you an idea of what people were saying. So the first one is teachers' responses to international examples. So what you have here is a word doll which is distilled, the majority of words used when teachers were asked, what did you gain or what did you glean, what were you interested in the international examples. And with the way a word doll works, the bigger the word, the more times it was actually mentioned. So again, that real flavour of something that's to be Scottish, about learning. I think teachers were really keen on learning, and about value, about sabbaticals. The word unsure is there, and from the written responses, teachers seemed unsure which model they actually liked. One of the responses that really struck me when we asked the teachers what international examples did they like from the literature review, a huge amount of them wrote, didn't have time to read it. And I understand that, and it was something that the panel reflected on. Here, the next word doll that we're going to see was about, what factors, this is from the stakeholders. So we asked them the question in the survey, what factors do you think would influence people to go for promotion or to be part of promotion? And here you can see what our stakeholders have spoken about in terms of that. So the creation of the report was basically engaging with all the responses from the stakeholders. It was really about a series of panel meetings. The creation of subgroups, that was really quite important because there was so much data to look at that we created 2 different subgroups. One which was a subgroup around master's level learning and one a subgroup around head teachers' engagement there. Numerous iterations of the report shared with all stakeholders for comments. So I would say there was 4 or 5 different iterations of the report, and every time the panel met, the reports went back to the stakeholders. A hugely time-consuming process, but one that was well worth the investment because we eventually came to agreement as to the content and the structure. A number of delicate negotiations. It's very interesting in these processes that how people go about getting what they would like or getting their voices heard is maybe how I would put it. But it wasn't all straightforward, and it was interesting the emails and the phone calls that happened that you would find out about 3 weeks later. But that's all part of being an independent chair. That's all part of just listening, supporting, and constantly moving forward. And finally, the agreement of all stakeholders and panel members. Now, I think that is really important because if you think round the table was every single union in Scotland, was every single stakeholder in Scottish education, that when that report was published, they had agreed to it. So the negotiation part had happened at the beginning, rather once the recommendations were made. So thinking that it would have had a plain sailing through the kind of political arena and through the Joint Negotiating Committee. So that was very important, and everybody around the table committed to that piece of work. And one of the things that I thought could derail the whole process was the discussion around remuneration. And because the pay negotiations were going on during the process, that also added another layer of complexity and another layer of tension. And you could tell at the different meetings that we had where those pay negotiations were. It was really interesting. And beyond that, the Brexit word was happening. And every morning I would wake up and I could see parallels between what was happening in the panel and possibly what was happening in the UK government in terms of people staking their claim to something. But it was agreed. And it was agreed there were 10 recommendations. We started with 24. And we distilled them down to 10. I'm not going to take you through all 10, I'll take you through 5. And I've picked these 5 because I think they're relevant to us. So recommendation 1 was that there was principles for career pathways, and that should be adopted by all schools. It's a complex system in Scotland. The Head Teachers Charter, which I talked about at the start, gives head teachers huge amount of autonomy within their school. So if a head teacher is going to staff their school in a specific way, have a career structure within the school in a specific way, then there are key principles that they have to adhere to. Principles of opportunity in terms of parity of opportunity, principles of support in terms if someone is given a lead role, how are they supported, and principles of recognition. And those principles of recognition are about time and or remuneration. So it was really clear that regardless of what happened in schools, that these principles were adopted. And what that allowed was flexibility in an ever-changing system. So it made sure that there was an underlying framework of principles which adhered to within a career pathway for all teachers in Scotland. The second recommendation I want to share with you is establishing a specialist role in curricular pedagogy and policy, and the creation of a new lead teacher role. And the lead teacher role, the teacher would be lead of X or lead of Y. It could be curricular, it could be policy driven, but that lead teacher followed exactly the same career structure that the traditional teacher does in Scotland. So you could have a lead teacher at a principal teacher level, a lead teacher at an assistant head teacher level, a lead teacher at a head teacher level, and a lead teacher at a local authority level. So there was matching across the scales in terms of career progression. And this should, it should be an expansion of time-bound leadership roles at the bottom point there. That was really connected to what our early career teachers were talking about being given an opportunity to lead something for a specific amount of time. The fifth one, fifth recommendation is a national model of sabbatical should be developed for all teachers, including head teachers, that is both attractive and sustainable. So this is a model of sabbaticals where it's a co-funding model, a model where teachers can opt in to a sabbatical. If you look at sort of Australia and Canada, they have a model where teachers can commit 10% of their salary over a period of 5 years. And after 5 years, they're entitled to a 6-month sabbatical. And it's an opt-in system. It's not something that you have to do. In a lot of the data that we gleaned from teachers, it was something they'd be interesting at different points in their career, something our early career teachers were very interested, and something that our mid to late career teachers were interested in as well. And as a panel, this is probably the recommendation that got the most support and needed the least negotiation. Recommendation 6, and that one is really one that took a huge amount. High quality, systematic, coherent and accessible support for career development should be available to all teachers. So it was making a very clear and bold statement as to what we would be looking for. Teachers being able to plan their career, to have access to coaching and mentoring, succession planning being a really integral part, and specific programs of learning. So that was something, again, did not need a huge amount of negotiation. Recommendation 7. Never has a sentence had so many iterations. I think that sentence was rewritten probably about 15 times to get the specific nuance. A great debate. Should Scotland's profession be masters? And the data from our teachers was very much 50-50. And the panel, I think, was very much split 50-50. So what we have here is a beautiful example of a negotiated statement that sort of is not very clear, but quite clear as to the direction of travel in terms, but also importantly for us as teacher educators, you can see that it has an impact on initial teacher education. So the sentence is, further steps should be taken to promote teaching as a master's profession while recognising the importance of work-based professional learning and experience. So these are the recommendations that I wanted to share with yourselves. My reflections, policy creation by consensus. It's not groundbreaking, creative, radical recommendations because there has to be negotiation and you tend to move towards the middle ground. I did at times feel that the language used lacked clarity, but it was the language of consensus and the language of negotiation. Where is the report now? The report has been accepted and all its recommendations by government. It's been accepted by the Joint Negotiating Committee, and there are now small committees set up to take forward all the recommendations. For the future for teachers in Scotland, I hope it will begin to unzip the profession and allow much more flexibility and movement. And for teacher education, it's going to begin to change to embed master's learning at a very early stage in a teacher's career. My final reflection is how difficult it is to create any kind of policy in a really changing and shifting environment. It's hugely influenced by political will, and also influenced by stakeholders who are passionate and dedicated to making sure children's lives are improved. I really would like to draw on the work of a well-known 20th century philosopher in framing my final thoughts, and that's the work of Dusty Springfield, who sang, "How can I be sure in a world that's constantly changing? How can I be sure where I stand with you?"
Thank you, Moyra. On the Masters, I could have used some of those words a bit more myself recently. And thank you for the reference to Dusty. Can we have any questions for Moyra? There must be some.
Elaine Sharpin, Trinity St David. Moyra, thank you very much. I was just interested in the timeline. How long did it take you, and what proportion of the time was given to the more nitty-gritty negotiations, and then how much time to publish the report? And did you have a single author of the report?
Right, good question. So the panel first met in June 2018, and the report was published in April 2019, which is a short time. That was driven by Scottish Government, but also by me. As a panel, I feel sometimes you can spend too long with a massive timescale where things drag on. Interestingly, I did a search on my diary last night because I wanted to find the exact date of the first meeting, and I counted over 35 individual meetings that I had in connection to this report. So although it was a short timescale, there was a huge amount of time spent. The panel met 10 times, each of those meetings round about 4 hours. The meeting with the data was an all-day meeting. So there was a lot of time given to the creation of the report, although the timescale is hugely short. I would say the nitty-gritty started 2/3 of the way through the process, when really on paper we were beginning to commit. And what you would see was a cycle of, you would have a panel meeting, the nitty-gritty was on paper, they would take, stakeholders would take the paper back to their executive or their management group, and then they would have a discussion, and then it would come back to the panel. So the following meeting was much more feisty in terms of that. In terms of, was there a single author? No, there wasn't, but there was at the end, it was smoothed out to have kind of one voice without changing the meaning of it. It was absolutely smoothed out. Yeah.
We've got time for one more question. There must be another question, because this is fascinating stuff. A model of how to do things, I think. Another question? Okay, but really grateful to you, Moyra, and we learned really a lot, and if we could have something like this in England, it would be absolutely brilliant. So thank you very much indeed.